Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present my research. My name is Siegel, and my mentor was Kristen L. And my project is about psychiatry during the Holocaust. A brief background of who I am. My name is Ellie. I live in Los Angeles, California. I attend Windward High School, and I'm super interested in anything related to psychology, psychiatry, and child development. I have a Jewish background. I'm co-president of the Jewish Affinity Group at my school and a teaching assistant at a local religious school. Here is my thesis. So how did the abuse of power and lack of responsibility by psychiatrists during the Holocaust shape modern psychiatric ethics, and how do similar ethical violations such as over-medication, forced institutionalization, and insurance-driven care continue to affect the profession today? So I'm going to be talking about what happened to psychiatric patients during the Holocaust and see what lessons and themes we can take today. For a brief roadmap, I'll first be doing a historical overview and talking about what happened. Then I'll be talking about why this matters and how it has impacts today. For a brief historical overview, the first important event to mention is World War I. So World War I created an increase in demand for psychiatric care, specifically because of trauma and PTSD from the war. Germany took full responsibility for the World War I, which meant it created an economic depression in Germany, and so a decrease, which also created a decrease in quality and access of psychiatric care. So that meant that there was a decrease in access to psychiatric care at a time when more people needed it. Um, the next thing that I want to mention is pseudoscience at the time. So there was a lot of eugenics ideas circulating around the public at the time. Many people supported this idea of racial purity, and a lot of people had this belief that mental illness was entirely genetic. In 1920, a psychiatrist published a book called The Permission to Destroy Unworthy Life, which he talked about how severely mentally ill people were empty shells of human beings and they had lives unworthy of living. This was an ideological and economic argument because he calculated the cost of keeping psychiatric patients in hospitals, and then he advocated for their medical murder. And so this document's really important because it shows when cost control and economic means were prioritized over patients' existence. In 1933, the Nazis passed the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseases, and this is a really important law because it marked the beginning of the sterilization program. So, this law declared that anyone suffering from a hereditary condition needed to be medically sterilized. So, these conditions included schizophrenia, alcoholism, and basically any illness that they deemed as mentally ill at the time. This led to a program called Action T4, which was a medical murder program by the Nazis, and it essentially was like a state-sponsored systemic murder program. And this was run primarily by psychiatrists with the help of physicians from 1939 to 1941. This is some statistics I have for you. So these numbers, which are so big, show the fundamental collapse of medical ethics at the time, and they show the extent to which this event occurred and how many psychiatric patients suffered. Something really important I want to highlight is that 100,000 psychiatric patients were killed from starvation even after the program was officially outlawed. So this shows the long-term impacts of the program. So the scale of these atrocities that I just talked about was made possible by a system of deception and secrecy. One thing to note is that there were gas chambers disguised as showers. So patients were being told that they were being taken to have a bath, and instead they were killed by the very doctors that they were taught to trust. And the two images show the Hadamar Death Center and the Hadamar Death Register. So Hadamar was a killing center, and essentially they kept detailed lists of all the patients they had, and they would falsify the official cause of death. So a really common one they used was pneumonia, and even though the staff knew that the patients had been murdered, they would still write down pneumonia or something else as an official cause of death. And even after these patients had been killed, these centers would still request payment for like living expenses and food expenses from the families, even though the families were unaware that their family member was no longer alive. So, when the public started to gain more awareness of what was happening with the gassing of these patients, the T4 organizers switched to lethal injections, which was meant to conceal the killings and make them harder to track. So we've looked at the deception that made this program possible, but I think something really essential to consider is the dehumanization of these individuals. So these victims were stripped of everything that made them human. To justify the mass murder, psychiatrists started referring to these patients as useless eaters and incurable idiots and people who have no value of life, which was meant to dehumanize them. Another argument that was made was this financial burden argument. So, as you can see from the piece of propaganda, which I've translated from German, was medical professionals were forced to decide between the nation versus individual rights. Um, and eugenics was framed as a practical solution to psychiatric patients being seen as straining hospital resources or costing a lot of money. So, eugenics was framed as a practical solution to the economic and political hardships at the time. So this all accumulated in the ethical failure, which was in 1939, Hitler wrote a letter, which I've put on the screen, that allowed certain psychiatrists to judge a patient's illness and then grant a mercy death. So a really important distinction that I want to make is that psychiatrists were not outwardly ordered to kill their patients, but they were allowed to. So this displays how some psychiatrists, definitely not all, but some, were sometimes willing participants in this program and that they were not explicitly forced to kill their patients, but many did anyways. And this also shows how many ideas were perpetuated at the time and became popular. And specifically, this is important for the field of psychiatry because the psychiatrist and patient relationship is built on a component of trust, which is such an important component of the profession. And this inherently dismantled that. So you might be wondering what does all this history have to do with today? And first of all, I'd like to say that this topic does not have the attention it deserves. I've taken a lot of classes on psychology that talk about psychiatry, and this has not been talked about. And I think a lot of people deem this event as one of the darkest, if not the darkest moments in the field of psychiatry. And it's rarely talked about even in medical schools or even in the field of psychiatry. And I think it's really important to reflect on this dark moment and see how we can take some of the themes and lessons of what happened and apply it to today. I think this whole presentation shows how psychiatrists have always held an important role in society, and especially today with an increased need for mental health care, have an even more important role in society. But we must make sure to check power and prioritize patients' rights because we've seen how quickly that can crumble. Um, like in the Holocaust, psychiatric patients lost all their autonomy um, and were framed as financial burdens, which led to abuse and murder, as I talked about. And today, while we might not see that today in the field of psychiatry, I think it's really important to note the insurance-based system of care that still prioritizes money over people sometimes. This can lead to problems that we have today with over-medication, lack of access to treatment, and lack of access for people who really need it, especially long-term treatment. I think insurance is a super powerful financial structure that provides access to many people, and it isn't all good or bad, but I think it's a really complex topic, and we must really consider human rights and make sure we're always focusing on patient-centered care, and making sure that patient-centered care is at the forefront of mental health care today. Just to summarize, I think the lessons that we can take from what happened to psychiatric patients during the Holocaust are lessons that we can implement today in the field of psychiatry, making sure people are aware of even what happened, making sure that we're prioritizing patient care and patient autonomy, making sure that people have access to personalized care if it's long-term treatment, long-term therapy if they need it. And I just think it's really important to look at history and how it reminds us how important it is to protect psychiatric patients' dignity and human rights today. And here's my works cited. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. That is a super important topic and so very timely. I know that there are so many discussions happening right now about people who are, suffering from mental illness, people who are suffering from addiction, and how our society treats them. Um, for everybody on the call and anybody who has studied mental health psychology, obviously we know it often means studying very triggering and difficult topics. And so I'm curious, what were the biggest challenges personally for you as you dove into such a triggering topic?
For me, I definitely had some moments in research where it was super hard to see just like how deep like the abuse was and how horribly treated some of these patients were. Um, I think approaching the topic with sensitivity is really important. I also talked to some of like my teachers, like my psychology teacher at school, and I reached out to some psychiatry professors and just talked about what happened. And I think like engaging in communication is a super helpful way to be able to express like the feelings that might come up when studying these really sensitive topics and also at the same time spreading awareness. So I think definitely it's important to recognize what happened and for people to be aware, but I think it's also really important to balance like your own emotions and your own mental health when approaching these topics.
Absolutely. And I know for many of us who study mental health and psychology, an important part of, kind of being in that space and doing the research is trying to figure out what can I do to make an impact to turn now what I know into some sort of positive, way to make a change. I'm curious, what's next for you?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. I think the first thing that I want to do is awareness. I think the first thing that is important in this topic is educating people. I think that there's such a lack of awareness and education about this topic. Um, I think that so many people don't even know what happened. So I think my first step is whether it's starting clubs or making announcements online or keep continuing to share my research paper that I wrote. I think the thing that I really want to focus on is making sure as many people as possible know about this, specifically people in the mental health field or interested in mental health.
That's great. I'm so glad that you're going to, carry what you've learned forward and make sure to, build awareness of it. Because I mentioned in our practice session, I studied psychology and mental health in college, and you're absolutely right. This was not covered. So this was eye opening for me as well. Thank you again so much.